Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're mapping out the incredible, honestly fascinating evolution of the Egyptian military. If you really want to understand the modern Middle East, you've got to look closely at the hardware, the history, and the sheer mechanical ingenuity sitting in Egyptian motor pools right now. Now, to really set the stage for why this matters today, I want to start by hooking you with a pretty high-stakes quote from February 2026. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told a closed session of the Knesset that the Egyptian army is getting stronger and Israel needs to watch it. Think about the regional context lately. With Hamas and Hezbollah dismantled, Syria's military essentially flattened, and Iran's capabilities gutted, well, Egypt is basically the last real army left standing in the region. And that makes understanding their arsenal absolutely crucial. Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the legacy of the 1973 war, then explore their global equipment mix, look at the big push for domestic production, unpack their air defense web, and finally discuss securing the Sinai Peninsula. We'll decode this whole complex web step by step. All right, Section 1, Legacy of the 1973 War, Catalyst for Modernization. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to understand what Egypt drives and flies today, we absolutely have to look back at the crucibles of the 20th century. After taking devastating losses in 1967, Egypt had to learn some really tough tactical lessons. Fast forward to 1973, and Egyptian engineers brilliantly used high-pressure water hoses to literally blast gaps right through the Suez Canal sandbanks. This allowed Soviet-built T-55 tanks to roll straight through and actually take ground. It was genius. But just days later, the Egyptian 25th Brigade learned the hard way that a bad plan will still lose you the fight when 14 Israeli M60 Pattons ambushed and destroyed their entire brigade in a single afternoon. These wild swings, stunning successes, and crushing defeats forced Egypt to completely rethink its armor and its tactics. Then, 1979 hits, the Camp David Accords are signed, and overnight, the whole arms pipeline just flips. Egypt stops buying from Moscow and pivots straight to Washington. Suddenly, you've got American M60A3s and F-16s pouring in to replace all that aging Soviet gear. But here's the thing. Egypt never threw the old stuff away, not at all. They just kept it running through cannibalized parts and sheer, stubborn mechanical willpower. And that leads us directly into the wildly unique state of their current inventory.
Which brings us to Section 2, a global equipment mix, or as I like to call it, the Frankenstein arsenal.
Egypt integrates systems from rival global superpowers in ways that literally no other military even attempts. Because they've spent decades buying from everyone, their navy is the ultimate example of this. Take the October-class missile boat. It's a masterclass in hybrid engineering. You've got a Soviet-designed hull, powered by Italian engines, running British electronics, and firing French anti-ship missiles. I mean, wow. Then there's the Al-Aziz-class frigates, based on a German Meko A200 modular design built locally at the Alexandria Shipyard Company, but they're slapping American surface-to-air missiles and Chinese anti-ship missiles onto the exact same deck. Oh, and those French-built Mistral-class amphibious assault ships, they bought them at a discount and just loaded them up with Russian Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters. It is the most incredible mix-and-match approach to warfare. And if you want a perfect example of David versus Goliath economics, look at the SP-122. Between 1987 and 2000, Egypt took American Paladin self-propelled howitzer chassis, ripped out the big American guns, and literally bolted surplus Soviet D-32 towed guns in their place. Why would they do that? Because they had actual warehouses packed to the roof with old Soviet ammunition, plus the factories to make more. No other country bought this thing. It exists exclusively in the Egyptian army, an American tracked vehicle firing Soviet shells. Brilliant.
But, relying on foreign powers does come with a massive downside: export restrictions. Washington has consistently refused to sell Egypt long-range AMRAAM missiles for their American F-16s. And when Egypt bought the highly advanced French Rafale, U.S. export restrictions on certain internal components meant France couldn't sell them the long-range Meteor missile either. So what does Cairo do? They turn around and buy Russian MiG-29Ms and Chinese fighters. For one reason, Russia would actually give them the R-77 long-range air-to-air missiles. They are practically forced to buy from rivals just to secure the capabilities they need to fight.
Moving on to Section 3, Domestic Weapons Production, the push for independence. This push for independence is absolutely crucial, because if you can't rely on Washington, Moscow, or Beijing to give you what you need without strings attached, well, you've got to build it yourself.
The crown jewel here is Factory 200, sitting just outside Cairo. It is literally the only facility outside the United States that builds the M1A1 Abrams tank. Now, it produces an export variant using tungsten penetrators instead of depleted uranium, but it's still an absolute beast. And what's wild is the scale. Factory 200 is expanding. That exact same heavy production line is now churning out advanced South Korean K-9 Thunder howitzers through a massive tech transfer deal, alongside the automated K-11 fire direction vehicle. They're even making their own rocket launchers, like the RAB-200, built right there on modified Soviet tractor chassis. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer deception of the Hamza 3. This is an indigenous Egyptian kamikaze drone powered by AI. But the real genius isn't just the software, it's a physical hardware trick. They bolt these things called Lüneburg lenses onto the wings. Basically, they're passive radar reflectors that massively inflate the drone's radar signature. So put yourself in the shoes of an enemy air defense operator. On your screen, this cheap, coffee table-sized drone looks exactly like a massive incoming F-16 fighter jet. You panic, you fire a $1 million interceptor missile at it, and boom! You've just wasted your best, most expensive ammunition on a cheap decoy while the real strike package flies right in behind it. That brings us to Section 4. The air defense web, sealing the sky. That drone deception trick leads us perfectly into how Egypt defends its own airspace. Their air defense force is arguably the most deeply layered, historically proven part of their entire military doctrine. You really cannot overstate how legendary their air defense history is. Back in the 1973 war, Egypt set up what Israeli pilots terrifiedly called a missile wall around the Suez Canal using Soviet SA-6 and SA-3 batteries. It was this devastatingly dense trap that actually shot down a quarter of Israel's entire pre-war frontline fleet. That loss rate was so incredibly severe, so shocking, that the Pentagon realized their own jets wouldn't survive a war with the Soviets. This led, in a direct chain of cause and effect, to the creation of the stealth research program and the American F-117 Nighthawk. Let that sink in. Egyptian air defense crews quite literally forced the invention of modern American stealth technology. Today, that missile wall is vastly more complex. Egypt manages a wildly diverse inventory, layering all these systems from around the globe into one seamless, impenetrable web. You've got the Russian S-300VM acting as the long arm, designed to push enemy command jets back 200 kilometers. Then they operate the American Norwegian NASAMS 3, the exact same system protecting Washington, D.C. right now, alongside Russian books manned by the professional descendants of those lethal 1973 crews. Throw in the combat-proven German IRIS-T medium-range system, and it is just an incredible multinational shield. But here is the terrifying modern math of drone warfare that keeps generals awake at night. An IRIS-T interceptor missile costs over $1 million to fire. A cheap Iranian-style suicide drone, that costs maybe $20,000. You do the math. Any opposing force can bankrupt a military simply by launching more cheap drones than the defenders have million-dollar missiles to shoot them down with. So how on earth does Egypt protect its expensive missile batteries from getting swarmed by cheap drones? Well, they use the Skywolf Guardian. Unveiled at a Cairo Defense Expo, this German-built system is a beautifully simple solution. It projects a directed beam of high-power electromagnetic pulses. It doesn't even fire a physical projectile. It literally just fries the electronic circuits inside the drone, burning out its flight computer and dropping it silently from the sky. It's the perfect, cost-effective counter to the terrifying economics of modern drone swarms. Finally, Section 5, securing the Sinai Peninsula. Because all of this hardware converges on one incredibly volatile piece of land. Despite the 1979 peace treaty originally aiming to keep the Sinai demilitarized, Egypt has moved some serious hardware into the zone, mostly driven by heavy counterinsurgency operations since 2014. They're deploying indigenous TEMSA MRAPs with V-shaped hulls designed to deflect roadside IED blasts outward. Their infantry are using locally produced Sucker 105 rocket launchers that fire thermobaric rounds. These are specifically designed to send massive pressure waves deep underground to collapse hidden tunnel networks. But what's really causing concern over in Tel Aviv? Egypt has stationed Chinese HQ-9B batteries near El Arish. This system is essentially China's long-range equivalent to the Russian S-400. From the northern Sinai, its radar reach stares right across the border, covering southern Israeli airspace all the way past Eilat. So the crucial point is this. Egypt has painstakingly assembled a military that just defies standard logic. They've perfectly blended Soviet mechanical stubbornness, top-tier American aerospace technology, Chinese missile reach, and their own rapidly booming domestic production into a single, cohesive force. When you look at those long-range radars staring across the border, and you consider that Egypt is the last fully intact military giant in the region, it leaves us with one incredibly provocative question. With this deeply integrated web of global technology, can Egypt's military hold the Sinai against any modern adversary that comes knocking? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.